Today we will talk about how real men write poetry.
Thanks, Arnold. So today we'll be talking about that, plus the life of peasants, gender roles, and just society in general during the Tang and Song eras. So we've been talking about how during the Tang and Song era, the bureaucracy tended to be favored over, let's say, the landed aristocracy. And so the landed aristocracy gave up lots of its privileges and lots of its wealth, and a lot of that came, saw the bureaucracy as the chief beneficiary. What we're also going to see is that the peasants also benefit from that significantly as well. So for some context, generally what makes an aristocrat is the fact that aristocrats generally have lots of land and very often are society's chief warriors or military commanders. And that's something that we see in dozens of societies. So whether you're talking about landowners in Song China or landowners in feudal Europe, you kind of see those general patterns. So during this time period, both the Tang and the Song want to cultivate new areas, and the government encourages people to sort of settle in barren lands. Those barren lands will obviously be quite a bit easier to farm with the development or the adoption of the almighty champa rice. The government didn't just provide empty words and encouragement, they also actually allocated large funds in order for state-funded irrigation to be expanded. This is also during a time period where you have new seeds, fertilizers, wheelbarrows, and of course we've already talked about the almighty steel tools of the Song. Also, little reminder that we have that thing called the Grand Canal, which also helps transport produce quickly, which is sort of important because, whenever you have a harvest, it's always a race against time to get your goods to an actual marketplace to sell. So back to land ownership. So during the Tang and Song era, the issue is you have this military aristocratic class that seems to be too big for its britches and needs to be brought down to size. So if the power of the aristocracy comes from the land, well, here's what you do. You kind of take away the land. Maybe not immediately, but what the state basically does is every time a landowner dies, they basically take their entire estate, and much of that estate is actually divided up amongst the peasant classes, which, by the way, means that this system was very popular for the peasants. It means that most households in Song China especially were actually property owners. The United States tries to think of itself or tends to think of itself as a property owning democracy. But you can kind of make the argument that at least on the property ownership bit, the Song had high levels of property ownership at levels not really seen until like modernity. So that they didn't completely confiscate aristocratic estates, but they would basically confiscate 80%. So they would leave a fifth of the estate available for the families, which basically reduces the power of the aristocracy significantly. So family life in the Tang and Song era was complicated, and not just for the normal reasons that families are always complicated. So you have the preference for multi-generational extended family households. This, in other words, you have parents, children, as well as maybe aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents maybe in the same household or the same general vicinity. The issue with that is, even though it's preferred, even during the economically productive time period of the Song, whether or not that's a financial possibility is a different question. But still, that was generally the preference, and of course, like at other points in Chinese history, ancestor worship was still practiced along with a variety of other traditions, including Confucianism, Buddhism, and Taoism. Filial piety, in other words, obedience, was still the main value. What does that mean in practice? Well, for example, a child could be beheaded if they struck their parent or grandparent. Now, on the other hand, if you engaged in a petty sibling rivalry, you like wrestle with your brother or sister or something like that, don't worry, the punishment is much more lax. It's only about 2.5 years of hard labor for a child. Now, whether or not these penalties were actually followed is kind of beyond the point. The fact is that the male head of household had the power of life and death over all other males and females. With Confucianism's emphasis on patriarchy and male domination, the role of women during the Tang, and even more so during the Song era, was very much reduced. It's ironic, though, that during this era of peak patriarchal control, that you actually see women, to a certain extent, break the highest of all possible glass ceilings. For the first and only time in Chinese history, you actually have a female ruler that rules by herself under her own name. There are periods of history where dowager empresses will, in practice, rule as regents, most specifically during the 19th century, where you have the Dowager Empress Shizi. But even though it would be understood that the Dowager Empress might be the power behind the throne, she's still behind the throne. Empress Wu was an emperor who actually ruled under her own name. That being said, because of the emergence of Confucianism, a lot of Confucian scholars criticized Empress Wu, especially because of her support of Buddhism, but also because of the fact that she is a woman and Confucianism is intensely patriarchal. So, among other things, Confucian scholars would retroactively criticize Empress Wu for killing her political opponents or torturing them, unlike, for example, the emperor of the Sui dynasty, the founder of the Tang dynasty, Gaozu, who totally didn't have Emperor Yang assassinated, frickin' Yang, or unlike all of these other emperors who begin life as generals and overthrow their predecessors. You also have the example of Yang Guifei, who is the Emperor Xuanzang's favorite concubine. Concubines are not wives technically, but they could wield incredible power and importance at court, and sometimes their children of concubines could be the heirs to the empire, the next emperor. So Yang Guifei was very powerful and influential, and yet she's blamed for the Anli Shan rebellion of 755. So with Neo-Confucianism's support for traditional Confucian values like patriarchy, you begin to see elite women, and just women in general, have reduced opportunities outside the home. So physical confinement is emphasized. The woman's role as a homemaker is very much emphasized. And basically from this point on, men and women are idealized to live separate lives. You see many paintings during the time period that show men hanging out with other men and women in the company of other women. So you see traditional values like virginity emphasized for girls, marital fidelity for wives, and chastity for widows after the deaths of their husbands. On the other hand, men are allowed great freedom. They generally are favored in inheritance and divorce, and women initiating divorce or just divorce in general, declines significantly during the era of Neo-Confucianism. And it shouldn't be surprising, given this system, that girls are not given education, but boys definitely are, and boys' education is definitely emphasized. That being said, traditional gender roles for males are maybe not what you would expect. So with the decline of the aristocracy and the emergence of the bureaucracy, the scholar gentry is sort of idealized in Chinese society. And so scholar bureaucrats are supposed to live lives of relaxation and leisure. They're supposed to hang out with other men, as previously stated, but they're supposed to also live lives of quiet contemplation. They're supposed to participate in the arts. They're supposed to study literature, and all men were basically expected to write poetry. You're not a real man unless you can belt out a verse. One of the more horrific examples of female subordination emerges during this time period, and of course is the practice of foot binding. Foot binding was considered highly attractive and even erotic by men, and it emerges in the Five Kingdoms period, probably among court dancers, but then gradually spreads throughout the Song dynasty. So this process entails girls of around 2 to 5 years old having their feet bound before the arch of the foot adequately develops. So what happens is that the first step, it feels weird even talking about this because it just sounds so horrific. The feet are soaked in water around winter so that the cold sort of numbs the toes. The toenails are clipped very low. The feet are massaged, and that basically all bones are then broken except for the big toe. And then the other toes kind of curl under it. And the idea is that they are constantly wrapped and unwrapped, and eventually this is the result. So women would wear delicate and very elaborate slippers to sort of advertise the small size of their feet. They tended to walk on their heels, and they sort of teetered awkwardly, and this was considered very attractive to men. But the fact is, you're still breaking the feet of a human being, and it actually limits their mobility, sometimes for the rest of their life. It deforms the muscles, of course, it breaks all the bones, it's extremely painful, and basically, if we're talking about women being confined to the home, if gender norms didn't do it, well, then this definitely does. Women often couldn't leave the household just for practical reasons. The fact that they weren't very mobile because of the practice of foot binding. There are several attempts to ban the practice, one in 1664, but ultimately it's just too deep in the cultural memory to effectively root it out. Then in 1949, the communists effectively stamp it out after the end of the Civil War. But the communists and the changes they bring, well, that will be a story for another time. Till next time.